I guess we'll get started. So as I said, today's session is being recorded and we made available after the event on our webpage, and we will send you a link once it's ready as well. Before we begin today, I would like to say this webinar is being hosted from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. So for those who haven't met me before at one of the previous sessions, my name is Michelle Hanslow. I'm an Environment Project Officer at Nillumbik Shire Council, and I began with Council around 3 years ago as a Biodiversity Officer, but for the last 2 and a bit years I've been managing 3 different deer projects, 2 focused on deer control and also another project on education and engagement around deer management. So today's presentation is part of our collaborative Community Deer Action project, which is funded by our Communities Environment Program grant from the federal government. And this is the 5th and last online session that we're presenting as part of this series. And tonight we're going to be focusing on property management options to reduce deer damage, or integrated pest management for deer, whichever term you feel more comfortable with. So tonight's been designed to provide some non-lethal management options for deer, which might be more relevant for some residential properties, but it also will be relevant for bush blocks and for farming properties as well. It is interactive. This is a meeting, not a webinar, so you can actually talk to us if you want to, rather than just typing your questions into the comments. But please do write your questions into the comments, the chat section, so that we know that you want to ask these questions, or you can hit the little raise hand button, which is one of the options in your toolbar at the top or the bottom, and we can unmute you and you can come online and speak with us in person to ask your question. Basic housekeeping, but please just leave your audio and video off if you're not presenting or asking a question. And for anyone here who might be a deer controller or have some sort of deer related business, tonight's not about promoting your services, so no putting your contact details into the chat, please. So now I would like to formally introduce you to our special guest presenter for tonight. Hopefully he's got his video on. Yes, he does. So Richard Francis is from Abzeco, and he's an ecologist and one of Council's deer controllers. And he's got extensive experience in habitat management and ecology for the protection of our Indigenous flora and fauna. And coupled with his knowledge of deer behaviour, he is well placed to explain how some of the simple actions you can undertake on your own property can help manage deer on your property. And you can do these things easily, some of them. So we'll hear from him shortly. And Stephanie Orive might have turned her video off. That's okay. She looks after our land management incentive program grants, as well as sustainable agriculture across Nillumbik. So she's going to be helping me out tonight with questions and any tech issues that we might come across. So thank you very much to both of you. So firstly, I'd just like to ask if people could write into the chat section. This is a bit of a test to see if you can work out how to do it. Where you're from. I'd love to know whether you're local in Nillumbik or from somewhere else, bush block, residential block, and what in particular you'd like to gain from tonight. What questions do you really want answered, or what are your issues that you hope that we will cover? And if they're not covered but are relevant tonight, we're happy to hear about them and have a chat. So hopefully people can write some comments in for me, and I hope that I'll be able to see some of those as we go. All right, just put the agenda up while we're writing in those comments. Yeah, so I'd just like to add that there are lots of other methods that can be trialled or have been trialled to deter deer from our gardens, sprays and water and all sorts of things. And if you've had any success with anything at your property or failures with the methods that you've tried, I'd really love to hear about these in the comments, or you can talk to us about it because they're always really interesting. Okay, just having a look at some of these little comments coming through. Wow, Adelaide Hills, that doesn't sound nearby. That's fantastic. Oh, great to have some people from outside of the council. Oh, look, these things are that we're going to be talking about are relevant to areas anywhere that there's deer. Let's face it, it's not a Nillumbik specific problem. So, yes, bush blocks, farming blocks, they all require different sort of techniques to manage the deer and yeah. Okay, there's a great range here. Excellent, excellent. All right, so tonight we're going to be covering when you might be considering some non-lethal control rather than shooting, and then Richard will detail some of the options that you can implement on your property, which might include modification of harbour, restricting access to water, strategic fence placement and how to erect those fences safely, and some disruption or scaring techniques as well. And then how to integrate all those together and apply them at the correct time for maximum benefit to dispersing or removing the deer from your property. We'll try and provide as much time as we can for questions, and at the end of each topic we'll pause to see if there's any questions that you'd like to have answered. All right, so at this point I will hand over to Richard and he can share with you his learnings. Over to you,
Indeed.
Richard.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Okay, maybe I don't need to see all your faces. All right. Okay, so this evening we're talking about what we tend to call integrated pest management, and that is where you use a range of different options or techniques to apply downward pressure on a population or try to exclude animals such as pest animals like deer from access to a particular area. Now, it's important to understand, of course, and I'm sure everyone does, that deer are a landscape scale problem. They're a problem that is now here in peri-urban Melbourne, in Nillumbik and in many areas, but the origins are from often a long way away from where you live. So deer were relatively prevalent in the Highlands, the Central Highlands, East Gippsland for many years, but because of a series of events, and those events were actually broad-scale wildfire events, vegetation over huge, vast areas of the landscape, millions of hectares, changed so that we had regrowth vegetation, very dense vegetation. It was very suitable for deer, and deer populations were able to grow and expand. Of course, these habitats only have a certain carrying capacity, and as that vegetation matures, it has less carrying capacity. But the upshot is that deer moved through the landscape and became habituated with a whole range of different environments, and they continue to move and disperse today. So a problem on your property is very difficult to deal with just on your property. We need to think very broadly about the landscape that we're in. But it's very important that we all consider what we can do on our property and how we can contribute to deer management in the broader landscape. And it's the interest in doing so is becoming extremely obvious across huge areas by the calls that we're getting in. If you know, Michelle gets calls constantly from the community. We've recently been doing this collaborative deer program, and so we're actually going out and meeting with community groups, and people are setting up deer action groups, and that's fantastic. So what I will do is run through this range of techniques that we often present to land managers, and I'll go over each one. I won't go into a huge amount of detail. They're pretty straightforward concepts, and I will then present a case study. So an area that we're currently looking at it's in Nillumbik, out in the kind of North Warrandyte, Christmas Hills area, and I'll discuss how we could roll out this range of techniques to get maximum impact on deer populations, and an impact that is hopefully fairly sustained. I think everyone understands that dealing with the deer issue is not as simple as removing deer from your area and they're gone. They're very much like most of the herbivores we have in our landscape, be they kangaroos, rabbits. They breed, they move. If we want to manage rabbits in our landscape, we have to do it continuously. We do it at a particular time of year, and we do a range of techniques in a particular sequence in order to get the breeding population down low enough that we have a sustained reduction in rabbit numbers for a period of time, and then we roll out those techniques again to manage the rabbits. And it's very similar for deer. They're just very big rabbits. Okay, so, and as Michelle said, questions are important. What I will do is I'll stop periodically and ask if there are any particular questions that I should be answering from the team here. Cool. So I guess we're finding that there's a whole range of issues. I have people really worried about the agapanthus all getting eaten at their house. And then we have vineyards where crops are getting heavily affected by deer. And then, of course, our ecosystems that are getting changed by the presence of deer, reducing habitat values, simplifying the floristics, the species, plant species that are in those areas. So there's a lot of different issues. So we've identified our issues, what they are. It's then a matter of running through the range of different options that we might have. If we're worried about fruit trees, perhaps we could put up some kind of fencing, and it might be quite a localized area that we could fence to protect those core assets at our house. A lot of people now, I'm finding, are fencing a domestic zone, so people who have reasonably large properties are putting up deer exclusion fences around, say, a couple of acres around their house. And that's the area that they manage for fire, where they mow. That's where their fruit trees are, their gardens, their swimming pool, and fencing right up along their driveways to the front gate. So they're basically drawing a line in the sand and saying, look, deer, we accept you're over there. We don't want you here, but this is for us. And that's a great idea. So if we run through what really are the issues the deer present to us, then maybe it might be as simple as excluding them from particular areas, and otherwise we can live with them. Fencing at the moment tends to be the most common method for managing deer, other than, removing them by direct control like shooting. There's a lot of other deterrents that people ask about, and I've seen applied across the landscape to mixed result. Things like sound, prickly plants, smelly stuff that disrupts the deer's ability to be able to detect predators and the like, so it's uncomfortable for them. And I've had people say that they put in plants that deer don't like to eat. But using, say, particular prickly plants or plants with a bad taste, it's not one that I tend to recommend, and that's because I worry about these plants becoming weeds, because if deer don't eat them, it's likely that other things don't eat them. And if they don't get eaten, they're not going to get managed. And so there's a chance they can become a problem in the landscape. So create one problem by trying to solve another. So they're things that the kinds of options that we might do around the house that I'll expand on around your property that I'll talk about further. The other thing we need to consider is managing habitat. So if we've got high biodiversity value areas or crops, perhaps strategic fencing might be the idea. And so by strategic fencing, it may be perhaps fencing off a water point so that deer are going to spend less time in an area because they're very attracted to water. They need to drink water every day. They also like to wallow, so water and wallowing go together. There's a lot of wallow points I see on dams or below dam walls. So strategic fencing may be that we fence off the water point, or perhaps there's a particular patch of vegetation that the deer like to live in. A dense thicket of kunzea that's regenerated when stock were taken off a property or something like that. And we don't necessarily, for some reason, that dense vegetation, perhaps we don't want to remove it. It's too costly, or you want it there to protect this area from erosion. Perhaps fencing off that harbour instead. You've then made it more uncomfortable for deer to be in the landscape. They don't have an area they feel safe to live in. They don't have access to water. You know, your property is becoming less attractive to them. Another type of strategic fencing I'm seeing quite a bit of is just very long straight fences where a number of landholders have deer coming in from, say, a reserve or a national park, or perhaps even just an area of kind of fairly bushy private land. And so they've just got one fence all the way along each of their properties that runs from property to property to property. So instead of you having to fence off your whole property, you only have to fence off one boundary. Your neighbour only has to fence off one boundary. It requires a collective effort. And that kind of collective effort is going to be a bit of a topic of today's discussion. Because as I said at the start, deer are a landscape scale problem. So they're not something that we can effectively manage in our own backyard, but managing them in your backyard is an important part of the overall solution. So if we fence off a farm dam, then we need to consider there might be some flow-on effects. So we might be better off then thinking, well, I'll put in some troughs for stock. That's a great option. If we've fenced off a dam, the dam is going to actually improve in quality because stock aren't going into it, deer aren't going into it. So the water quality improve. And with a trough, you can turn troughs on and off. So you can make sure there's not water available for stock and that deer might use at times when you don't have stock in that paddock. And if fencing is too costly or the vegetation is a weed, then removing that harbour is probably your best option. Now, I'm not suggesting that you remove native vegetation, but it may be that modifying the structure of that vegetation is appropriate. We do need to consider that permits are required for managing native vegetation, so it's a good idea to get to consult with council or a local expert to see whether the vegetation you want to manage would require a permit or not. But what I'm finding a lot at this time of year, and it's very common, is that deer actually are spending increasingly more of their time harbouring in blackberries, and it's in the hotter months they tend to go into much cooler shaded areas. They spend a lot of time in dense Kunzia thickets, that's Bergen, thickets, trying to stay cool during summer. Whereas when we come into these cooler months, they're out in the blackberry. They eat blackberry. I'm seeing a lot more grazing of blackberry than I ever have. But the deer are trying to go to places where they can get access to sunlight, because remember they're actually harbouring mostly during the day, so they want to get exposed to the sun but be sheltered from the wind and from predators. Now, there aren't a lot of predators of deer in Australia. I mean, dogs and humans are really their only predators here, but they still behave like they're trying to evade a predator. And so a lot of their the way they move through the landscape, the way they harbour, is because they're trying to avoid predators, and the key predator is a tiger. And so they've got a lot of reason to try and hide. They're scary. So, and it's one of the reasons why sambar are so hard to actually track and hunt down during the day. Okay, so that's a little bit of an overview. So this is some of the harbour that we find. So the right-hand photo is actually a thicket of Kunzia regrowth on a property that did have cattle on it, now has a vineyard and now has a strategic fence. That's in the Yarra Valley. And there's basically nothing in the understory, particularly nothing edible. And the kind of black tree or shrub on the right, that's a palatable shrub. It has no leaves at all on it. It's been heavily stripped. And so there's a lot of deer activity in this thick vegetation, and they feel very safe in there. On the left, well, I think everyone's seen a blackberry thicket, but that one is in an area where there is actually not a deer problem, and it looks fine. It's got all its canes. What I'm seeing now, though, in Nillumbik is actually deer reducing the cover of blackberry in some areas. Quite amazing. Not a particularly good solution, of course, because if they're eating blackberry, they're probably running out of other things. Wouldn't be their first choice. So on the right there is a regenerating thicket of Kunzia Bergen. It's a species that's done increasingly well since the millennium drought. It's always done well in grazed vegetation. It's not particularly palatable. It's myrtaceous, so it's related to, I guess, eucalypts and that group. It's got volatile oils in its leaves, pretty astringent. I mean, some people call it petrol bush. That's because it's got all these volatile oils in it. Not particularly nice to eat. So it's done very well because the deer are not grazing it to the extent that they're grazing other plants, and so it has a competitive edge. They leave it, so it's able to grow and form very dense stands. It's a prolific seeder and it's good at colonising. And the deer, even their activity around it, the disturbance that they create around the thickets of Kunzia, the pugging of the ground, the eating of the competition, means that they accelerate that regeneration of Kunzia. So they're actually promoting the growth and establishment of Kunzia by their very activity, and then they're benefiting from the harbour it provides. So on the left is a property, it's actually a property that has a lot of deer on it. That's why all of the trees and shrubs there have their lowest branches are 2 metres off the ground. that kind of landscape is where deer would forage, but they're not going to harbour. And so it's also a good area where we could instigate other forms of control, like a lethal control technique. All right. This is just an exclusion plot there. It just shows the effect that herbivores can have on the landscape. Obviously, the grazing pressure outside that fenced area is pretty high, and grazing pressure on the left. So fencing is when I mention it to people, it's expensive. They say, yeah, but fencing, who's going to pay for that? Is one of the first things I hear, and I totally understand. I'm getting some fences built at the moment for a particular project, and they're costing $47 or $48 a metre because they're excluding rabbits, kangaroos, and deer. So, you know, if you have to do a kilometre of fencing, that's a lot of money. But they are effective, and once you have a fence up, if you maintain it, there's nothing else to do. It's there. What people are looking at, though, increasingly is different ways of doing fencing that is effective, or let's say effective enough to limit deer movement. And there's a range of fences that we're seeing that they're on an angle. They strategically use electric hot wires, and a combination of just basically plain fencing wire and electric fencing wire in such a way that you're excluding deer, but you're allowing other animals to move. Because if we've got a conservation area that we're trying to manage deer in, this photo on the right of a deer fence, which is also a rabbit-proof fence, it's going to exclude just about everything. So perhaps we could be more strategic about what we exclude, and in doing so, find some more cost-effective methods. A number of property owners I've spoken to have used 4 plain wires. So they have an electric bottom wire, then an unelectrified wire, then an electrified wire. So they alternate electrified and unelectrified. But the middle wire it provides an arc. So if a deer tries to put its head between the wires, it arcs across those wires. And they're effective for their cattle, but other animals move through quite well. Echidnas and wombats, because wombats will damage fences, and I've seen many occasions there's a deer fence on a property in the Yarra Valley that I've been working on, and it's just getting smashed by wombats. And once a wombat starts to open up the bottom, then the kangaroos are also going through, and the wallabies, and then the deer. They come under there. There's less deer. Deer don't like to go under the fences as much, but they will go under this, particularly if there's good food on the other side. Another thing that comes up is putting things on the fences or putting things around the place to try and scare the deer. On the left there, this deer fence, you can see the Kunzia Harbour there. There's actually a solar-powered light on that fence that is triggered when there's movement. And I do deer control on this property, and the deer just don't care about it anymore. They trigger it. You can be on the property. I mean, the kangaroos do it all the time. They become habituated to it. And the same with anything you do. Initially, they're a bit cautious, but if it doesn't actually bite them or hurt them, they just get used to it. So strategic fencing around particular assets is a really good option. And you can actually get away with a fairly simple fence if your fenced area is not too big. So if deer can pretty much can easily move around your fence, and there's still plenty of area to forage around your fence, they don't seem to bother going in, or at least they don't go in often enough to have a significant impact. It is a risk jumping a fence. They're an animal that doesn't want to be injured. If they're injured, obviously it's going to be difficult for them to continue to live their life. It's a wild animal. And so I know one of the guests here tonight listening to the presentation has a fence, and in fact I believe it's that one on the left. And just saying the other day how amazing the vegetation is inside the fenced area and how different it is inside and out. I wish I had a chance to go there today and get a photo of this same fenced area. I'll get to that. This fence on the right is a pretty serious fence. I think it's probably a bit over the top. It's a small area, probably didn't need to go to that extent for such a small plot. It just probably didn't need to be that serious. There's so much vegetation around here, they're not going to feel the need to jump into that small area. So, all right, deer are very good at getting through fences. I have a friend in Ringwood who had a deer in his backyard, and he was watching it through the window, and it was just browsing around, and then it obviously decided it wanted to be on the other side of his paling fence, so it just, from a standing jump, just jumped over it. He said it didn't seem to worry it at all. He just went over the paling fence, which is interesting because it must have been on the other side of that fence before or something like that, because one of the barriers that we have used for kangaroos and deer is dense shade cloth fencing that we just put a few plain wires and fold the shade cloth over the fence. And we thought that it's because they couldn't see through very well that it might concern them. But the fact that this deer was in Ringwood jumping over people's paling fences is quite amazing. But maybe it could see over the fence before it jumped. Maybe it jumped up and had a look. And at Yanyan Reservoir, I've had several reports of people seeing deer jumping over the cyclone fence there. We know that they've got places they go under it, but yeah, people have spooked deer in their cars and seen the deer jump over that. So they can do it if they really need to. So fences are a really good barrier there, but they cost a lot. You can reduce the cost of these things by, you know, do it yourself. This is just an example of people's ingenuity, putting together a system to unroll the wire so that they can put up their fence. So what type of fence, how much you need to invest, is it worthwhile? Depends on a number of considerations. You know, maybe you could get away with individual tree guards around your fruit trees rather than a massive fence around your whole property. And it's a common problem. It comes up again and again. Tree guards are actually very expensive, and there's a lot of labour involved in a tree guard. I did a costing for someone the other day where it wasn't a huge area, but they could get away with, say, I think it was a 1.5 metre high fence. They were putting in about somewhere between 10 and 15,000 plants. So if you're paying someone to plant a plant and put a tree guard on it, it can add $6 or $7 easily per plant because hardwood stakes, they're not cheap. Tree guards aren't cheap. So particularly if they're going to be effective against herbivores. So if you're trying to protect 10,000 plants and it's going to cost you $7 per plant, that's $70,000 in tree guards. So you can get quite a lot of fencing for that. And we're seeing increasingly fences going up. Hancocks who have plantations in the Strzelecki's, they're starting to put up deer fencing strategically because they're losing so many pine seedlings. So it's doing the maths. What are the plants worth? What might you get for that plant in the long term? How much are your options, you know? And they were using these big plastic sheaths around their plants. They're like 2-meter plant sheaths, and the deer was still damaging the plants, but of course there were effects on the growth of the plant, and they had to actually go and manage these plastic sheaths because they can be a problem in themselves. So how long do you need to fence for? Once, like with Hancocks, once their plantation gets to a particular height, they don't need the fence anymore. So there's options there. They can put in a cheap fence because it only has to work well enough for long enough. On another job we just quoted was for temporary fencing. And that was actually a really interesting process because the temporary fencing, it worked out, was going to cost about $40 a metre installed. But of course, at the end of it, you had the temporary fencing. So you could then pay someone to come and move it. And it's very cost effective. The difficulty that we had to deal with was the fact that temporary fencing has a gap under it. So it's no good if you want to keep rabbits out. But with temporary fencing, you can potentially let some animals go through, but keep out the bigger animals like deer. And if deer are a problem, probably kangaroos or wallabies are too. So, but wallabies, they're really happy to go under a fence. So, small fenced area, think about fencing it off or putting just tree guards around your fruit trees. And with crops, you need bigger fences. So, as I said before, working with your landholders, doing one boundary fence and them doing a boundary fence, getting these big fenced plots. Native vegetation is proving to be one of the more challenging areas. So at this point, Michelle, are there any particular questions that people are coming up about these topics yet?
No, we've just had one. Somebody was saying that they've got a problem where the Samba have broken down their post and wire rural fence, and getting it repaired doesn't guarantee that deer won't smash it down again. So I guess they're just curious about the design. They thought that maybe heavy-duty cyclone fencing would work, but then that stops the wildlife moving through.
So it depends what you're trying to contain with your fencing. So I know one problem near Warburton, a property owner there who has cattle. He had problems with the deer getting their legs stuck in his fences because he had multiple strands of wire, and he said that deer they pretty much could just step over it because it's a standard post and wire farm fence. So the larger deer could stand over it, but occasionally they get their legs stuck and then they would rip his fence posts out because they're such a powerful animal and they're stuck. So there's two things, and it's a good question. I actually just had an answer today given me by someone as well. So this particular guy went for 2 strands of fencing wire. He said they just weren't, they don't get stuck in it. It's fine, but they were 2 electric strands, and that was keeping his cows in. The other thing that I was told today by Sam Webster, who's a fencer and a good person to call if you've got questions, just very hard to get him to come to your house because he's so busy. He was talking about a nylon coated wire that he uses on horse fences, because horses have the same problem with getting their legs stuck in a fence. And it turns out it's because the high tensile wire they tend to get caught on that. It's not smooth enough, or it wraps around their hair, or I don't know why. I didn't actually ask why. I probably should. But he said they use this plastic. It's a black plastic coated wire, and horses don't get injured. They don't get injured by it. They don't get stuck in it. So, so there's a couple of concepts. Yep.
Yeah, and I have also heard, it's not in the chat, but people have commented on kangaroos jumping over these fences and being caught in the wires as well. So is there any sort of guidelines for how to construct these extra wires so that it doesn't cause an issue for them?
So the problem with kangaroos is the distance between the top wires, and they're the 2 plain wires. I'm sorry for explaining this for those people who might not like to hear it, but yeah, the problem is that their back legs, we call their hoppers, so their long feet, when they're jumping over the fence, their toes basically get caught under the top wire, and that can flip them over, and then because their foot is so long, it catches on the next wire, and so they end up hanging from their back legs, which very difficult for them to get out of. Obviously, they've got those little arms, a bit like the T-Rex. Yeah, they find it hard to get out of. So it's the top wires, the distance between them. And I've also heard that
so it should be closer.
The top wire is not really tight. It's more of a problem if you haven't kept your fences really taut, because there's some give when they hit it, and it becomes more problematic. So keeping your wires well tensioned and having your top wires a good distance apart. You want them further apart, not too close together. But there is, it's a really common problem.
Yep.
Hard to get away from, actually.
Yeah, so it's probably better just to make sure you've got your fence in an area where perhaps you're not going to get roos regularly jumping over potentially, so placement might be helpful.
We are in Nillumbik though.
Yeah, I know. Do have a couple more questions. How effective has the shade cloth fencing been for re-veg sites, and is it cost effective? Thanks for that question, Peter.
So it has been extremely effective. First used it back in the 90s at Latrobe Wildlife Reserves, and it was for roos in that occasion. Now it was particularly effective because it also helped to shelter from wind and stop weed seeds moving. So there was multiple reasons why we were using shade cloth, and we had a fence there that we could put it over. So we could just put a couple of extra plain wires and put it over. It was really effective, but animals will still try and dig under it. So we ended up putting a rabbit skirt on the bottom, but it just didn't need to be very big. So it was plain wires, bit of a rabbit netting, a skirt, so the wire goes down and then across the ground for 300 mil. It's pegged. That was much better.
Right. And Don's made the comment that he's added a white plastic coated sight wire at the top, and that seems to allow both the kangaroos to see it and clear it in a jump and deter the deer from attempting to get in there.
Yeah, those white plastic coated wires are really good. We just need one that doesn't deteriorate, because they do deteriorate. I was actually looking at one today on a reserve, and it was just coming apart. But yeah,
become fragile. And the other thing that there was a heading in there that I probably should have jumped in at with council permits for fencing as well. So you just need to bear in mind that if anyone is considering building a fence, that there are rules around where you can build fences and what type of construction is required, and that's related to your planning scheme zone or your overlay that's in place as well. So always a good idea to talk to the planning department first, just to make sure that you've covered all your bases and you know what you need to consider. And hopefully you've got a good fencing contractor. They'll already know the rules for the local area. But yeah, just don't go building a fence without making that phone call first.
Yeah, and in a lot of areas, even if you're doing a boundary fence, you're often only allowed to do a post and wire farm fence. So you've got a right to fence on your property boundary, and you can, to some extent, remove some vegetation if necessary for a very short distance. But putting in a deer fence is very different.
Yeah.
From putting in a post and wire farm fence.
Absolutely.
So pretty common in Nillumbik that you need a permit.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of other rules as well, unfortunately. So internal fencing you still need permits for.
Right.
And technically you should have to do an offset, but I'm not going to start going into that now.
Let's not.
Yeah,
yes. John's made is it an old wives' tale that deer are deterred by human hair, being hung up in pantyhose on the fence? I think that was one of the deterrents I looked at. I think it comes down to the human scent or the scent of another animal that makes them think that there's a predator in the area, isn't there?
Yeah, so a lot of the time it's just change. And that deer they're really aware of their surroundings. And if you change something, they stop. So it doesn't matter how well I hide a game camera. First deer that comes along, one of the first things it does is go and look straight at the damn camera. But the next couple of times it goes past, it ignores it.
Yeah,
so,
right. Yeah.
Putting anything up, whether it's hair in pantyhose or anything, it will make the deer react in some way. Human scent is something they really don't like if they've got a negative association with it. Obviously, deer become pretty habituated to anything because I've got a couple of property owners. One in particular says, I just hate hearing them outside my bedroom window eating the veggies. So they're within meters of his bedroom window. Yeah. They're obviously used to the smell of humans, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so that is one of the deterrents that,
short term
doesn't effective in the short term. Most deterrents are like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And only one final comment from Nikki. You can get pure plastic wire that can be hand strained and holds up really well.
That sounds great, especially if it lasts.
Could I ask one more question on the fencing? Could you tell us the structure of the temporary electric fencing setup that you found useful?
Yeah, so it was 4 wires, 2 plain, 2 electrified.
On what kind of post?
So I did use star pickets with insulators for the electric wires and a solar powered electric wires. Yeah.
Okay, so temporary but not super temporary.
That's right.
Cool.
Yeah. It was a few years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
okay.
3 to 5 years, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's about establishing plants and protecting an area.
Yeah.
We've often found that we have to put up temporary fences around things that we do just to stop even stock. If we put up a camera to look for deer, if there's steers in the paddock, they bloody knock the things over, lick them. So I've actually got temporary fencing just for doing that. All right. So fencing around water points is something that we really should all be doing. And if you think about our landscape, particularly in the peri-urban areas, but anywhere within an hour of a capital city, it's been gentrified. It's been baby boomerified almost. A lot of these larger farms have become smaller properties and people that are buying lifestyle properties, and hell, I would be one of them. I'd love to be one of them. On properties that are anywhere from 20 to 100 acres. And they're properties that were formerly working properties, had plenty of stock. Now they've got a house, they've been destocked. They might have a couple of stock on there, like a couple of horses or a couple of alpacas, but not flocks of sheep or mobs of cattle. And what we find is that having stock on a property actually deters kangaroos and to some extent deer. It's unsettling for them. And what has happened is we've now got lots of people living in the peri-urban area. They've got dams. If there wasn't a dam on their property, it's one of the first things they do is put in at least one dam. And all of these dams are unfenced. The paddocks have got no stock or very little stock. And so we've got this massive landscape that's available for herbivores. And that's provided the perfect opportunity for kangaroo numbers to expand. They're not limited by the availability of water anymore. So they're no longer nomadic. They don't have to move through the landscape to get access to water. And hell, there's no stock eating the grass, so there's plenty of feed around. And deer are the same. Deer are moved into these unstocked paddocks, use the water by unstocking them. And some of these properties are not managed actively, so you get lots of thickets of vegetation. Some of it, great regen. But a lot of it is heavily impacted by grazing pressure, and it's a combination of grazing pressure. It's not just deer. Deer, rabbits, there might be a few stock animals there, kangaroos, wallabies, wombats. It's the combined impact of all of that grazing pressure that means that we get on these regenerating properties often thickets of vegetation that's just not palatable, very dense, and often weeds like blackberry, gorse, pittosporum thickets. So we're actually creating this environment with water, harbour and food. So limiting the availability of resources is going to be a really important part of our strategic management. And this is a dam that's not far from a conservation reserve, and I found these wallows in Google Maps. They were that visible, and obviously this dam gets visited a lot. It's pretty clear there. The photo on the right, it's a dam on one of these properties that doesn't have stock, but it has a dam and it has lots of kunzea and lots of herbivores. Again, on the left, this is below a massive farm dam, beautiful dam, unstocked property, lots of grazing pressure, and these are a series of wallows that are being utilised by deer regularly. So, okay, we can't fence off everything. We can't clear all the vegetation. And, well, you might be able to fence your property, but it might be something that's not really within your budget. And let's face it, it often isn't. So what other things can we do? Increasingly, we're finding that deer will modify the behaviour because of dogs. And so dogs also affect any wildlife as well, but if you strategically use trained dogs in the landscape, you can change deer behaviour and reduce the suitability of harbour. So this technique, and something I came up with a group recently, is really just having regular walks through gully systems that have dense harbour in them, or hillsides that have thickets of harbour in them, regularly going through these areas with dogs and just disrupting the deer so they don't feel like it's a safe place to sleep. They feel like it's not a safe place to give birth and have their young. That is a real option. Steph, the other day you mentioned this concept, or that it's been found that having companion animals, companion dogs. Do you want to tell us about that one?
Yep. A couple of weeks ago, we had a talk from a researcher who is looking at guardian dogs, so the Maremma sheepdogs, for threatened species protection, mainly from foxes and cats. But they've also found in their trials that the presence of the Maremma dogs reduces the abundance of deer and also roos in the paddocks that have the dogs compared to adjacent non-dog containing paddocks. So it's a nice proof of concept if you've got stock. Perhaps the addition of a guardian dog or another type of dog with your stock might be able to reduce deer moving through your property quite cheaply and effectively.
Because the Maremas sleep with the stock. They live with, and apparently like half a dozen sheep or so is what's required for the Maremas, and they just spend all their time there. Now, was I hearing you were looking for people that might be interested in trialling this, or you'd like to hear from people that?
I would love to hear from people. I am still exploring the concept with this researcher, and obviously we'll need to look for funding opportunities if we want to set up any large-scale trials. But as a tool in the toolbox, I think it's a great option, especially if you're already managing livestock of any kind. You can buddy them with poultry, cows, sheep, horses, any kind of stock, really. Your pet rabbits, guinea pigs.
Bandicoots.
Or bandicoots, even better.
That'd be great.
Definitely bandicoots.
I'll put the papers in the chat that Linda sent me.
That'd be great, thanks. So that was a really good finding from a research study, because I've been getting a lot of good anecdotal reports that deer are deterred by dogs, and that by people walking through areas with dogs regularly, coupled with other deterrents, could be a really useful way to manage them, to basically exclude them from your area. One deterrent that I would suggest is bird scare rounds. You need a firearms license, but it's not actually shooting. These are bird scare rounds, and it's a normal shotgun cartridge, but inside it is what's effectively a penny bunger, just a little firecracker. And when you shoot it, it lights the fuse in it. And so this will travel about 50 metres or 70 metres, somewhere thereabouts, in an arc through the air and then explode. So one of the things I'm going to mention in a minute about our strategic program is the concept of, if there is lethal control going on in your area or on your property. And so deer are being shot in your local landscape. Deer associate that with a life-threatening event. So they associate firearms, the sounds of firearms and shooting as a life-threatening event. So if you were out walking gun dogs or just any dog really through Deer Harbour and you spooked a deer, firing a shotgun cartridge with a bird scare round in it would reinforce this idea that the dogs and you are a potentially lethal event, because you're making the deer associate shooting with the dogs and you. So you're really reinforcing that. And so they will not feel safe in that harbour anymore. We hope. All right. This is an example here in North Warrandyte. This driveway, the whole length of this driveway is lined with agapanthus. So these agapanthus are both sides of the driveway. You can see them really clearly here in the foreground. That's because this is the roaming range of a German short-haired pointer that lives in the house at the end of this driveway. And it appears, so the agapanthus are all here, but they're grazed down to the ground. But within only a matter of a few metres, they're completely untouched. And this is a bit of a deer pass over a ridge here. The deer are happy to graze it, but they've worked out that if they get too far down the driveway, the dog knows they're there. So that's an example of deer behaviour resulting from the presence of a dog on a property. Now, there's lots of other deterrents around that get spooked. I'm not aware of any deterrents, non-lethal deterrents that work in the long term. Apart from, there has been some talk that sprinklers or water jets that jet out and hit deer do work. So if we, instead of having a solar powered light, we had a solar powered jet of water, that might work. But deer get used to things, so they would walk around it. You'd need to have them over a very wide area. You'd need to have like this boundary of sprinklers. But even then, they might work out that they just have to kind of bolt through it, get to the other side, and then it stops. Short-term problem. I don't know. I'd be interested to find out. But that's apparently something that lasts, that does deter deer. I spoke earlier about this idea of planting plants that deer don't like, that they won't eat. Bit of a concern around that. Scents, I haven't used any kind of scent type deterrents, but no, I've heard that they don't last for very long, and the lights don't last long. One property owner said that he was getting a reasonable result from lights, but he had to move them constantly. So yeah, that sounds problematic. And the deer is already there to trigger your light, so it's not going to get deterred until it's actually walked close enough to your light source to actually trigger it.
Can I add a funny comment? Well, it's not very funny, it's a bit sad for them, but a landholder did say to me they were using lights to try and deter the deer, but they felt that all they were doing was showing the deer where the food was by lighting it up for them. Yeah, great stuff.
One type of light that does work often is a spotlight. If you start shining a spotlight, but the only reason shining a spotlight works is if deer are being shot in the landscape by people using a spotlight. So the deer have an association with spotlights of a life-threatening event. And deer know the difference between car lights and spotlights. Car lights always travel along roads. If I drive my Polaris, this all-wheel drive vehicle I've got, into a paddock where someone has been spotlighting, they will flee very quickly if my lights kind of go across the paddock. So spotlights, yeah, they only work if there's an association. And so we need to build on those associations that deer have.
There has been a question about those associations, actually. Where is it? Nikki. So it was about the sounds, the bird scaring and things like that, and saying that if there's shooting in the area, making a sound, but doesn't that you have to rely on them having been shot before, so they have to know that the loud bang is associated with being killed, I suppose, and would they not start to habituate to hearing that bird scare if there is no association? So
that's right.
Yeah, so you can't use it unless there's actual shooting nearby.
Yeah, so it has to be coupled with a life-threatening event.
Okay.
And that's the thing about integrated management. Each thing you do works with the other things, the other techniques, and collectively you end up with a result. But it doesn't necessarily have to be shooting on your property, it can be shooting next door.
Yeah, and there's plenty of shooting going on in Nillumbik on lots of properties. So yeah,
I hear that.
Hard pressed to find one that didn't have shooting nearby if you had deer, I reckon.
Yep. And so that's important. Go on if you've got another question.
And then there was a question about the prickly plants. Nikki's got lots of questions tonight. Thank you. Why would planting native shrubs that deer don't like in your garden be a problem? They won't. Callistemon, melaleuca and coria in his or her experience.
Yeah, I found they eat those species often.
Well,
it might depend what type of coria, perhaps, but
yeah, and I know early on when Manningham started experiencing deer problem when they were surveying or monitoring for what sort of species were being eaten, that it was only a real limited number of species, and they're like, oh, that's okay, they're not eating this, this, and this, but they've changed, and whether that they're eating has changed because of lack of availability of the things that they really like, but yeah, they will move on to other species. So. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to try prickly plants, do native and locally indigenous species wherever possible. But there's no guarantee.
Eating paradoxa, like they're eating Acacia paradoxa.
Yeah, yeah.
So if there was an indigenous plant that I thought would work, I would tell you, but it tends to be Kunzia that they don't eat.
Yeah. That was for fallow deer. I don't know if they eat any differently to sambar.
Well, they would, yeah. They would eat differently.
Yeah.
Sambar have got a pretty amazing mouth, and people probably haven't seen it. So
you've got your.
I've actually got a photo. Don't worry. I've got a real sambar head.
Yeah. Does it have the jaw on it?
Yeah, this one does. But I'll show a photo rather than. It's a photo of a real sambar, obviously. Yeah, one of the people listening to this talk actually just put a sambar head in my ute. Yes.
That sounds really gross. That's the kind of thing that happens to you, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. So, can we see that, Michelle?
Yeah. That's great. That's gross.
Okay. I know it's a bit gross.
I've never seen a deer mouth. That's fascinating.
So it's actually important to understand the physiology of an animal that you're trying to manage. So deer, this is the bottom jaw. Deer have teeth on the bottom jaw. They don't have teeth on the top jaw. They have this plate, and on sambar, that plate is really tough. And that is why, if you've noticed in your garden, plants that deer eat, it's not a clean cut. They tend to bite, and if it's a bit woody, they kind of mash the end, then they pull their head backwards. So there's often a little tag of plant hanging off there. So it's not clean. Wallabies, kangaroos, teeth on top and the bottom, they cut it very cleanly. But if deer are browsing, it's a pretty messed up kind of a cut. So they can eat quite prickly stuff like blackberries. I mean, they're out there eating blackberries now. I'm watching them right now. They're not blackberries that are nice, young, soft, fresh growth. Blackberries have stopped growing weeks ago. So you need some pretty gnarly stuff. So it's things like African boxthorn, you know, plants that have grown with this kind of herbivory. That's what can deal with the deer. But we don't want to be encouraging people to plant African boxthorn. And there's a few other African plants that would work. But our native plants don't really seem to be able to deal with this kind of a browser. They're pretty gnarly. So there you go. Bit of deer anatomy. I tried to take that so there wasn't too much gore in the background. Right. How are we? Any more questions we should be dealing with, responding to? Because I'm going to talk about a kind of an area and a kind of a program that would work in a local area.
Yeah, yep. Somebody's trying out the minimise themselves in Strathewen, so that's great. We'll get in contact with them after tonight, and that's awesome. And yeah, just some comments about new people in lifestyle blocks loving the deer, and
oh, I get that one too.
Yeah, it's not really related to tonight, but yeah.
Sometimes their attitude changes after they hit one or two in their car. Yeah.
Yes, I've suggested if they eat their garden, they might change their mind as well. So yeah, but that's what these sessions are all about: is to show people some of the damage and yeah, some of the management tools as well. Okay, let's have a look at this case study.
Yeah, so most of what we've talked about is either costly or labour intensive, or both. So how do we do these things to try and maximise their effectiveness and minimise the effort? So firstly, there's this concept in pest management that we call pulses. So pulses of control, which is short bursts of intensive effort. It's used with fox control and rabbit control, and works equally well in deer control. Pulses that are timed to coincide with the life cycle of deer are going to work better. So deer go into their breeding time during autumn. Red deer and fallow deer are very seasonal in their breeding. It's quite a defined breeding period, a short, sharp pulse of breeding. Whereas sambar have a really long, drawn-out breeding period, and they can breed most times of the year. Really, they have times of year when they breed more. You know, tends to be during summer. They're not actively breeding, but other than summer, the next 9 months they could easily breed. We find young fawns. We observe young fawns most of the year at different stages. So there's pregnant deer still out there now that are dropping their young now, and then a lot of them have reasonably well formed young with them. So, but regardless of the fact that they have a long breeding period, this time of year is a particularly important time for them. At the autumn break, so when the rains come, they need to get in and they need to do a lot of feeding. They need to put on condition after summer because they're going to have young, they're going to be breastfeeding those young. They're going to be moving out into areas that they haven't been into much. So it's an important time of year to disrupt them because you're disrupting their breeding and you're disrupting them moving into your gully system, perhaps. So this is also a time of year when they're more visible out in the paddocks in numbers and they're congregating more. So it's a time of year where we tend to do a lot of lethal control, so shooting of deer, which means you're getting these shooting programs in your landscape, and you can then couple other activities with that shooting program. Fencing can be done at any time of year, but disrupting deer and removing them from the landscape by lethal control tend to be done together and during this autumn, winter, spring, and into early summer. But it's not like you want to be going out there all night, every night doing this. So working with your local landholders and working as a collective, starting things like deer action groups, getting a lot of like-minded people and kind of spreading the effort could really work. So what I've got here on this map, I've got these areas where I've mapped out where deer are most likely to be harbouring during the day. So I've tried to nut out in the landscape where they're likely to be sleeping or sheltering, where they're likely to be feeding, which is going to be these open grassy areas, and areas where we could undertake different types of control. So these yellow areas are where I've identified to get particularly good lethal control because you can see the deer and they're likely to be moving through there and there's obvious deer activity in those areas. So good place to intercept the deer. Really dense vegetated areas, the kind of areas where they harbour, are not well suited to lethal control. So there are other controls that we can do there though. And that's where, as I mentioned, going through those areas during the day with people talking, making noise, and even some kind of cap gun, even something that makes a bang like a gun. It doesn't have to be something you need a firearms license for and you're walking around with a shotgun. Something that makes a bang like a gun would be useful. Just going through with dogs alone is going to be disruptive for deer. I just don't know whether they might habituate with that. I've had some kind of anecdotal reports that deer in heavily hunted, heavily dogged areas, so where hound teams run a lot, are getting a little bit used to hounds. Because the thing about running a hound team in the Highlands is that the dogs are often a long way from the handlers and they see lots of deer, whereas the hound hunters don't necessarily get to see those interactions. And so there's not a life-threatening event associated with that hound. And so that leads me to think that unless the dog is a big, scary dog that might bite a deer, you know, my little beagle, I don't think really presents much of a threat to a deer. It can probably trick them for a while, but they're not going to feel like my beagle's going to rip their leg off. So perhaps walking with dogs through these areas where the dog's more like a wolf-sized animal, perhaps that might have a really major kind of a deterrent. And the what are they called? The minimise. They're a big dog. Minimise.
Yep.
Minimas are big, scary dogs. Yeah. I mean, apparently they're not that scary to people, but they do come across as being the kind of thing you'd want to avoid if you were a herbivore. So,
but when you're using dogs or suggesting the use of dogs, you're expecting them to be on lead and controlled, not running out and trying to hurt the deer. There's nothing about
that's
that.
right.
Just wanting to make that clear for everyone. The deer are okay.
Yeah, so I've got like a 10-metre long lead, and so the dogs can. I use them to actually scent out and find where the deer are and flush them. Some people have gun dogs. The ones I know of are they're German short-haired pointer and German wire-haired pointers, and I know people that do use those off lead, but they're these trained dogs, and they've even got a collar, and they can press a button and it doesn't electrocute them. Don't worry, it makes like a whistle sound or something, and the dog knows it has to just stop when it hears that. So it would need to be a restrained dog, because we wouldn't want, people going out there putting big dogs through chasing wildlife, like chasing deer and kangaroos and wallabies, and But so in this area, the concept is there's a period of lethal control on those areas where people are happy to have it and where it's suited, and then there's other areas. There's blackberry control. There's perhaps control of overabundant native vegetation like Kunzia, which is, ecological thinning, plants out of place. So it strategically go through. It's the kind of thing land care groups could get involved in. They could possibly get grant funding or assistance, going through helping each other, getting rid of the weeds, changing the structure of vegetation, get a walking group together and walk these areas. These lines that I've put are where I know deer do a lot of frequent movement, where there's a lot of deer trails. So walking those, because that's where the animals are moving between where they eat and where they sleep. And particularly walking through harbour and disrupting the deer. So doing that in pulses where there's all of the various techniques are used, and doing it at a time when deer are more vulnerable, and it's when they're breeding, when the females are looking for somewhere where they can safely give birth and raise a young deer. Disrupting it at that time is going to reduce population growth in that area, or at least push it to someone else's backyard.
I was just
hopefully when they're doing lethal control. But
I was just going to comment, aren't we just making it somebody else's problem? But possibly, but I think the fact that you're also stopping them from continuing that breeding process is pretty key as well. So yes, they might be still around, but they're not increasing in number. That's great.
That's the idea, and keeping them bouncing around. Now, it is a good time of summer, can be a good time if you've got resident deer in your gullies to disrupt them, but it is trickier. And it's hotter for starters, so it's harder on people, but there's also a lot of snakes around. It's not a time of year when we tend to take hounds or gun dogs into these areas where there's a lot of snakes. So that's, these are things that are worth considering. And the deer do tend to congregate in more heavily vegetated areas. I have been finding that in some of the gullies around Nillumbik, there are deer there all year round. And it's not uncommon to see a doe, a dominant female with a subordinate female and one or two other younger deer, like their fawns from the previous year, hanging with them, or a young male spiker hanging with them who's doesn't want to hang out with the big stags yet because they hurt. So yeah, it's pretty common to have about 4 deer in any gully in Nillumbik, pretty much.
Yeah, I imagine in the Alpine region you got a lot more fluctuation of movement because they will move down.
Up and down the...
Yeah, go up the
Gradient,
mountain in summer and back down towards the houses in winter, but we don't have that huge fluctuation, do we? I mean, where would they go if it was too hot here?
Yeah, into the Kunzia gullies.
Yeah, into the river.
Yeah, into the wallows.
Yeah, my most recent sighting of a deer was on a 38-degree day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon because it was standing in a little dam on the side of the road. It was clearly trying to cool down.
Yep, they fall asleep in them sometimes.
Okay, fair enough. Hence all the pictures of them in there.
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
That's yours, I think. So, is it? Or
yep, that's yes.
Oh.
Yes, this is partly me. I think I probably haven't got this slide in my presentation. These are some things that I want to do, so I probably can.
Is this your to-do list?
This,
it follows on from what I was saying. I mean, really, we know that it's a landscape scale problem. We know that if you've got a problem with deer, so do your neighbours. And so these deer action groups are a great idea. Getting action groups in the local area means that you can potentially get access to funding and support each other and maybe make some of that funding go further. So, yeah, it's worth considering.
Yeah. So, yeah, we do have the Land Management Incentive Program grants that Steph administers, plug. And some of those grants are really only available for land care groups that are auspiced, or I can't remember the terminology for it now, got it a bit wrong. Jump in, Steph, but it does enable them to apply for more funds than an individual landholder might get. But we do have a number of funding options available. Did you want to jump in, Steph?
Yes. So those largest size of grants is available for auspiced groups, which, if there is interest in forming those groups, then get in touch and we can certainly connect you with the Land Care Network or our friends group coordinators who might be able to guide you in setting up some kind of group, or our community group guys within council. Alternatively, we fund lots of rabbit and fox control groups with groups of a minimum of 5 neighbours working together that aren't auspiced, and it's just individual neighbours working together, and we welcome those kinds of options for community deer control, especially when we have landowners, blocks of all different sizes, some suitable for shooting, some not suitable for shooting, but deer impacting on all. So if everyone can chip in a little bit, and where shooting can be done where it's safe to do so, everyone shares the costs and everyone shares the benefits.
Yeah, you're involved in a program like that yourself, where you don't have to commit a great deal of funds towards it, but you reap the benefits by contributing to a much larger project, and the deer control happens somewhere else. I think it's great. Share the love. It does mean that if you're in little tiny properties, you can implement some of these actions that Richard has talked about, with going for your group walks and those sorts of things that can happen on any size property. And deer can bed down in some tiny properties, can't they? It's crazy. They just need that little bit of cover. So it might just not be feasible or practical or productive to do deer control on those sized properties. You know, I mean, you can do deer control anyway. You can sit on someone's roof and shoot down, and that can still be a very safe way of doing it, but not very pleasant for your neighbours because they're all very close by, and not very productive because you're probably only going to get one deer wandering through your property on occasion. So yeah, we always encourage people to, if they've got deer on their property, damaging their small gardens, if you've already done your fencing, you've done other things, taken whatever action you can, the other option is to collaborate with your neighbours who might have larger size properties, or chip in. It doesn't have to be a huge amount, and then council can offer additional support on top of that. It's usually up to 50% co-contribution. And we are looking at the fact that some of these actions that you're taking, like going for a walk and so forth, can be can count towards that co-contribution because it's landholder action, and we'll charge that out at, I can't remember if it's $20 or $40.
$25 an hour.
Yep. And that's fantastic. And so that counts towards your co-contribution. And if you've got a group as well, you don't all have to contribute equally. There's a whole range of things that we can, allow for you to work together to make it to work for your group, basically. And it can be 5 properties, it can be 20 properties. The more the merrier, and the bigger area that we can cover, the better. And I know even the map that Richard showed, we've got quite a few very small properties just a bit further to the east, and they're all screaming for help and wanting to put a group together, and we're trying to facilitate that. I've run one walk for the landholders there. I'm going to run another couple this weekend as well for them, just to have a look and see, these are the properties that have got deer damage but are really difficult to do any actual control work. We'll do the walking and scaring, but if we want to do some lethal control, we've got to incorporate these properties that are just over the road here, and if everyone works together, we can actually have some positive outcomes. And then on top of that, council will do our grant funded projects wherever we possibly can as well. So I'm just having a look to see if there's any other questions there. Is there any local resource that I can consult with to ensure that I'm able to set up my nightlife?
Yeah, look,
camera?
I can speak to John.
Yeah. Directly or now?
Look, I know where you live, John.
And we did run a session on identification and monitoring, and Richard presented a whole bunch of information on how to set up your cameras. So it sounds like you two can have a chat, but if anyone else is interested in finding out whether they've got deer hanging around their property and want to know how to set up their cameras, the video recording from that webinar is on the council website. Did anyone else have any specific questions about their property?
I've got one other thing.
Yeah.
Sorry. The walking through people's property, it's actually a really good idea to be in like a land care group or another group, because lots of people walking through other people's property, there are actually some liability issues because, you're on someone else's land, and so there's insurance issues there. Their house insurance, there's kind of insurance for it, but if you're with a land care group, you can have insurances. Yeah,
that's really interesting. Hadn't really thought about that. Because we sort of normally think of the land care groups sort of being needed to, I guess, help with insurance for deer control. But in fact, we'd probably recommend that we do recommend that the controllers themselves have insurance. So they're sort of covered on that front. But
I would hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we would make it mandatory. Oh, great. Great, John, we've all got your email. Now we'll give you a call later. But that's a really good point about actually other activities are not necessarily covered if you're not part of a land care group. So in terms of this, setting up these deer action groups, I mean, we covered this with our session on collaborating and working with your neighbours. We are thinking that it could be that your deer action group actually becomes a land care group. That's what the Cardinia Deer Management Coalition did. They just found that they were giving a lot of advice to people on, thanks Nikki, on deer control and management, and they didn't want to suddenly find that they were liable from, you know, giving someone advice that perhaps didn't work out as well as they would like, and oh, my crops are still being eaten, I'm going to blame you. And so they have incorporated themselves as become a land care group in their own right, so they are covered by Landcare Victoria's insurance. And so I'm really keen for that to happen in Nillumbik, so the land care groups can continue to do their weed control or re-veg or whatever their passion is. But if there's a group that is passionate about managing deer, oh my gosh, I'd love to hear from you. And if we could get together a group and make that a land care group in itself, I think that would be great, because then we're all focused on the same thing and we can work across all of Nillumbik as well.
Most of the land care groups I speak with, they're now becoming deer action groups effectively.
Yeah.
Because funnily enough.
Yeah, I'm not terribly surprised. So just sharing my screen again here. There we go. I just wanted to add to all of this that as part of this project, I've been super busy in the background preparing a stack of written materials that are based on some of these sessions and are also designed to help us move forward with putting our community group deer action groups into place. So, you know, I've got resources like identification of deer and, you know, how to identify, where's my mouse gone? Oh, there we go. Deer scats, all the deer identification, tracks and trails and so forth. We've got information about how to identify or recognise a firearms licence and what you need to do to be on the community directory, how to use your deer for, you know, harvesting and cooking that. And then we're also putting together some tools so that these groups that form can actually just have a template for how to record all your neighbour details so that you can notify them when you're doing control. And we'll set one up that's pretty similar for what we've learnt tonight. So actually a template for some non-lethal control options, and so you can have a bit of a plan with your neighbours for the sort of things that you're going to do and who's going to do what and timing for that. So yeah, we'll put that together shortly. We are coming to the end of this project, which is kind of great for me and kind of a bit sad, but just to let you know that the webinars that we have run have been recorded and are available on the council website on our environment page under when you want webinars, or if you type in Nillumbik and deer into YouTube, all the videos should come up there as well. We are still undertaking some property visits and assessments, so if you've got a pressing deer issue, and a number have been raised through these sessions, and we're happy to come out and have a look at your property and give you some advice on what we think the next best steps for you might be. And yeah, we do encourage you to get involved in some citizen science and actually help paint the picture of where deer are and you know, how many there might be. We need that information as to where they are in order to tell the government. Basically, they're currently developing a peri-urban deer management plan, and there are some gaping holes in where the deer are actually thought to be located. And I know there's more out there, but it needs everybody to be putting that information into DeerScan. It's just the easiest option for us to use at the moment. So please encourage you to do that, or set up your field cameras, as John mentioned before. And I'm hoping to organise a field day also at Plenty Gorge, just trying to get the dates and logistics sorted out for that as well, because they've got some fallow deer on that site and they're causing immense damage. So it'll be really fascinating to share that with everybody and show them what that deer control looks like. Not deer control, sorry, I'm reading my next screen. Deer damage looks like. And then our final formal session that we're running is coming up on the 30th of May from 2 to 4 at the Hurstbridge Hub. And that's a meet and greet with the hunters and controllers or fencing contractors or people that do drone surveys, a whole range of different services. So we're putting together a community deer directory, just getting the online form so that the service providers can put their details onto it, but that'll include professionals and volunteers. So those that are local to you, that are highly experienced, but might not be professional, but you might know them, and that would be great that you could use this resource to tap into some of the local people that can help you out. So I encourage you to come along to that. If you want to be presenting as a service provider, you'll need to be on our industry mailing list. If you're not, get in touch with me and I can tell you all about that. And if you're wanting to come along as a land owner, then I would suggest that you book a ticket and come along armed with your photos of your property or map so that we can have a look at it. And yeah, well, the service providers can tell you how they can help you with that. I think that made sense. All right, that at the moment is all I have to present. So I'm happy to take any further questions if there are any, and if there's not, we can have a slightly early night, and that'd also be lovely too. No other questions that have come through?
No, not at this stage. Thank you, Michelle and Richard. That was really interesting, as always.
Yeah, I get a lot out of these sessions too. Even I've been taking notes as we've been going along. So that is, I'm just trying to work out how to cancel out of my meeting, my screen as per usual. I always find the technology difficult. And it just won't let me click on the button. Oh, okay. Well, I might not be able to do that at the moment. So I might say thanks, everyone. So a big thank you to Richard for all that wealth of information. I have got Richard's contact details up there. Hope that's okay. So if you need to speak directly to an ecologist, you can. Should have asked for that in advance. And you can always contact me as well for a chat about your particular property issues as well. And yep, stay tuned for the website, and I'll send you out a post-event survey shortly where I'll include that information about the moramas as well. So we've got all that information for you.
Excellent.
Thank
you very much for organising, Michelle. It's been wonderful.
It's fun as always. I'll just try to see if I can.
And thanks for your contribution too, Steph.
It's very little. Thank you both of you for doing an amazing job.
No worries. Oh, I finally managed to stop sharing my screen. So I was like, oh, hi, Khan. We'll catch you all very soon.
Indeed.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.